MIMO, multiple input, multiple output wireless communications. Author of over 400 research papers with more than a dozen awards, including the Padma Bhushan, Ati Vishisht Seva Medal, to name a few. We are extremely delighted to have with us Dr. A.J. Paulraj, Chairman, 5G Forum India. We are extremely intrigued and keen to know his viewpoints on the 5G ecosystem in India. Sir, I request you to please address the gathering.
So tell me, can everybody see the screen? We have people blocking them, so I can move them out. Can everybody see screens? Or shall I ask this gentleman to move? Okay, thank you. Okay, we're running late, so I don't want to stand between you and the lunch, so I will try and cut short. I was supposed to speak for 20 minutes, I think, and suddenly Mr. Agarwal made it 1 hour. So I decided to talk a little bit about history, and so in order to fill up my 1 hour, but today I'll try and cut it back a little bit. So my main talk is going to be about history of mobile evolution. We all know about, we're all talking about 5G, but there was a 1, 2, and 3, and 4G. I want to talk a little bit about how that happened, and I also played a role in it. And then say a few words about 5G. And then I think with a lot of IoT people, a lot of startups here, so I want to talk about that too. So let me begin by first acknowledging Mr. Prabhash Singh, Member Technology, Mr. Shavikant, Member Services, Mr. Arogyaswami, Chairman, Managing Director, ITI, Mr. Agarwal, Director Marketing, Mr. Pradhan, Director Finance, Professor Kurchi, I will have some words to say about him later. Mr. Ramchandran, I think, has left us today. I also like to acknowledge Mr. C.S. Rao, and who is the chairman of QuadGen, and the reason I'm here today is because of him. So with that, let me start. So I remember for many years I had a picture of Pandit Nehru inaugurating ITI, or laying the foundation stone. And I also remember his remarks from those days about how ITI was really, I think we started ITI in 1948, the very first PSU. I should really ask, can you people hear me in the back? Okay? Okay, good. Very first PSU. And so he made a pledge to the country that this jewel of the country will serve the nation well. And I think for many years, for many decades, we did a good job and provided the infrastructure for our telecom networks. But with the rise of internet and mobile communications, I think and import of technologies, we went behind. But I think now it's time again to redeem that pledge of Pandit Nehru and to resurrect ITI to become a player. Also, before I start, I should say that sitting in my perch at Stanford and at the global level, India is not visible in the world in information technology. We don't have any companies in the top 100 which are global companies. So that is something we need to change, and I've been constantly harping on that. And I've been telling the government that within the next 10 years, we should have at least 3 or 4 companies in the top 100 in the world, which are global multinational companies. And that can only be done if we can create or invent some new ideas. It cannot be done by copying what others have done. So we need innovation to drive that. So with that, let me talk about the history of wireless. So, how do I move the slides? Or next slide, okay, good. So, no, go back. So, of course, wireless for many years, all these last, it really started around 1983. For the last 35 years has been about connecting everyone and everywhere. And here's an example of a Maasai tribesman in Africa, and of course, older elderly woman from India. And it has been a miraculous technology that all of us benefited from. And I think it really came to India properly about 1997, 98. And so I knew that it will really help India, and it certainly has transformed our country. Next slide. So if you go back to the science of radio science, I think the 2 big names are James Clerk Maxwell, who actually wrote his famous paper in 1858 at King's College. I often teach at King's College in London. And about 150th anniversary of the paper, there was a conference, and I spoke at the conference. So Maxwell was a genius, I mean, probably on par with Einstein. And his ability, Maxwell's equations not only put the foundations of radio science, but also, in fact, for example, I think he is foundation behind quantum theory. So really a very, very big name. And did that actually over a period of 3 or 4 years. He was in King's College. Then he went on to, I think, to Cambridge. And then Hendrik Hertz was in Berlin, and Maxwell had predicted the existence of radio waves, and Hendrik Hertz was a young professor who made some experiments and showed they actually exist. But he died very early, I think around 1880. So around 1895, people began to build systems. The next slide. And there were a number of names that came into wireless areas. And these were really more technology pioneers, not so much scientists. And of course, I would acknowledge Marconi, who invented telegraph in 1895 in Bologna, in Italy. I will be there actually in October 2nd and 3rd in that city because the Marconi Society is having a meeting there. And along the same time as him, Oliver Lodge at Birmingham University also had built a telegraph. So they had pretty much very similar technologies, but Marconi was an entrepreneur. He filed the patents and built his company. So Oliver Lodge is less well known, but probably had very similar technology. But also at the same time, we had J.C. Bose in Calcutta University, who in a very small room, 6 feet by 8 feet, did some amazing things and actually developed millimetric wave radios. He is slowly being recognized in the world, and I've been part of that. I think hopefully he'll get a major recognition this year globally. But he did some very remarkable work, and of course we all know him very well. And then the other big name was Fessenden, Reginald Fessenden, who developed, so Marconi and Oliver Lodge built the wireless telegraph, which is sending just dots and dashes. But it was Fessenden, Reginald Fessenden, working in my area, in Bay Area, developed AM radio. I think he was a Canadian, and I think it's something to do with Stanford. I'm not sure what exactly, but he was a pioneer of AM radio, which some of the older people, like certainly myself, have heard of. AM radio. It was a big thing in our many years ago. And then it is Major Edwin Armstrong who developed FM radio. And that was done around 1935, and he had a lot of problems with his patent, and he's a professor later at Columbia University, but died tragically. And the last name is, of course, is a very unusual name, is Hedy Lamarr. She was an actress in Hollywood. I actually never met any of these people, but I did meet her before she died. She invented frequency hopping radio back in 1942, and there's a long story. This year there's a movie come out called Bombshell, and particularly the women in the audience should see the movie. It's about how a young woman, I think that time pretty young woman, was also an actress, but also was a big inventor. And frequency hop radio, which underlies so many things we do, was really her idea. So then we go on to the next set of pioneers. Next slide. So by 1940, 45 or 50, we had radios, but the system was to have one single tower, like in London. They had about 20 channels, and with the underlying formula, they could support maybe about 1,000 subscribers, but only about 20 people can make a simultaneous call. And this wasn't a cellular system. It was one cell for the entire city. The idea of cellular wasn't fully invented. And this is the picture of the chief engineer of British Telecom inaugurating the first call in London, and in I think 1953. Next slide. But of course, the concept that for the amount of spectrum they had, they could only support 1,000 subscribers. But how do you scale that to hundreds of thousands or millions of subscribers? So that came from the cellular concept, and that was the idea of cellular concept was that you could form cells where you use a frequency, and then you would probably form a cluster of cells where each each cell had a unique frequency, so there are no adjacent cells with the same frequency, but then you reuse the clusters again and again. You do get some interference, but you manage it properly. You would get a scalable network where with a certain amount of spectrum you can still serve millions of people. And of course cellular systems brought an issue of also of handover. Now that you have the small cells, as you move, you got to hand over to the next cell base station. So handover was a key concept. So frequency reuse and handover were the ideas that were behind cellular. Next slide. And the people behind this were three persons at Bell Labs. D.H. Ring and W.R. Young, who I'd never met. I think Ring was probably a master's from Stanford. So they had the original idea of cellular, built some prototypes, but the technology those days wasn't good enough to really build a full system. It was Amos Joel who in the 1950s built a really operating cellular system, experimental system. I met Joel. He died a few years ago, but I met him about 10, 15 years ago. He's a very well-known name. So I would put these three people as the pioneers of cellular technology, which all of us benefit from. Next slide. So the issues in cellular systems is as follows. You have this reuse of a cluster, and then you reuse clusters. Therefore, you have interference from a same frequency cell. And of course, if you manage the cluster size, you can reduce the amount of interference. But if the cluster size becomes big, then the amount of channels per cell go down, so you lose spectral efficiency. So you want to make the cluster size as small as possible in order to reduce in order to get more spectral efficiency, but you get more interference. And let's assume that you had a signal power and an interference power, and nothing was fading. Things look good. Maybe this was a reuse 3 system. But unfortunately, signal fades. It can go all the way down to maybe 15, 20 dB down. And interference from another cell also fades, but fading is really fading typically. So not only the signal goes below the mean, it also goes above the mean. So for signal going below the mean is a bad thing. And for interference to go above the mean makes it worse. So in a reuse 3 system, you find that signal and interference are too close to each other, you can't get a call. So the only way to do that was to push the interference down, way down, to get the separation, you get 99%, 95% reliability of maintaining a certain SNR. In the first C system, AMP system, we needed about 14 dB of SNR. So you needed 14 dB of SNR at reliability over 95%. That means that you need to push difference down, your cell size, your cluster was much larger. And so that led to the evolution of cellular networks. So this drove it, and I'll explain how it drives the evolution. Next slide. So the first G cellular system was AMPS in the United States, NMT in Europe. It never came to India. I don't think it ever came to India, but I just about looked at it when I was visiting Stanford in '83, many years ago. Next slide. So the idea of AMPS was that it was a reuse of 21 because there was no control of fading on both sides. We had a lot of protection to get interference protection. So it's a very inefficient system. It was used analog FM radio invented by Edwin Armstrong, and it uses FDMA, frequency division multiple access. So you had number of channels per cell, per sector, and you would each user would use a different frequency, each channel. And it was developed by AT&T, Ericsson, and NTT, who's still, Ericsson certainly is still around. AT&T spun it off, Lucent, and so on and so forth. But this is the concept where AMPS was launched. But this technology never came to India. Next slide. The people behind this were two people I know well. They're still alive. Joel Engel and Dick Frankiel. I think one of them is a professor at in a university at New Jersey. They're all getting on in age, but they're both still around. And so they built the first AMP system. Next slide. But the AMP system initially built was actually meant for a mobile use, but really mobile mean car use. So there were big radios in the trunk of a car, Or you could buy a radio called a bag radio. It's like a full suitcase. You can push it in your back front seat, and then you would plug it into your cigarette lighter and make a call. That was a bag radio. But the big breakthrough came when we were looking for when you can actually have a handheld phone. That really made it possible to have a global market. And the first person to do that was Marty Cooper, a friend of mine, who actually, when I went to Stanford in '91, me and Marty started a company together. And he was that time heading Motorola's division, which came out with the phone. I think it was called the Dynatac phone. And Marty is very well known, and I think he occasionally comes to India. We should invite him to ITI. He's quite an amazing person. Next slide. So then, but AMPS is a very inefficient system, so a number of channels was limited, and when AMPS was deployed in the US, we were constantly out of capacity. Huge problems in Los Angeles and New York, no capacity. So all the world were looking for a more higher capacity system, and 2G GSM came at that time. It was actually developed in Europe. Late 80s, but deployment started in the early 90s, just about the time I landed at Stanford. Next slide. So in GSM, we brought a trick called frequency hopping, by which we could actually reduce the variability of the interference. So when the interference variability was reduced, we can push the interference closer to the signal, and we also got a little bit of more of diversity in the signal. So essentially, we could reduce the required SNR ratio, SIR ratio. So we can reduce the reuse to 9. So those days, now it's much higher, much better, but originally it was 9. And we went digital with the GSM, so that made it a little more efficient also. And, but not necessarily, there was lots of controversies around digital versus analog, and I was early part of that at Stanford. Some people didn't think digital will actually work. And they used an access system called TDMA. So GSM was a TDMA system. Many people built it, but and I began to know these companies, Ericsson, Alcatel, Matra, and so on and so forth. So next slide. So the three names which are associated with GSM are Thomas Hogg, who's actually chairman of HC, which actually built the GSM standard. He was a bureaucrat in Sweden. I've got to know him well, and he's got many other awards recently. And then Elaine Malberti and Jan Osterdet, I think they worked at Matra. Very brilliant people. You know, GSM was a really complex, big leap from AMPS. So in fact, and that was done in Europe. So when I landed in US, the US was very upset that Europe had taken a leap over the United States. So there were a lot of things being done in Europe to try and, in the US to try and catch up. Next slide. So then came, again we were looking for further capacity. So spectrum efficiency was the issue. And I told you spectrum efficiency means that you have to get better, tighter reuse. And so the ideas came from, originally from United States, and then later on from Japan and Europe, and we landed up what's called 3G WCDMA. Next slide. So the idea of in 3G WCDMA, we use a thing called SPED spectrum. This was not a new idea. It was developed probably by the MIT Lincoln Lab, and it was secret for many years. Only around 1950s it became publicly known. The US Army was using it, maybe, and also perhaps in Europe. And but then there were many papers about using CDMA in wireless networks. So when it was done actually by Qualcomm, it wasn't a new idea. But Qualcomm had a particular ring around it, or a twist around it. But more than that, I think Qualcomm's success was success of perseverance. Everybody said it won't work, but they said absolutely we're going to make it work. And I was a consultant to them, and they had many problems. But finally they got it cleaned up, and it finally worked. Next slide. So the two founders of Qualcomm, who I of course know very well, are Irvin Jacobs and Andy Viterbi, both alive but getting old. And Andy comes sometimes to Bangalore. I think he was here a few years ago. And both somewhat more retired, but I often see them at Stanford University. Next slide. So the idea of CDMA was to even go to actually reuse one. And of course, you can't do reuse one properly. So they did that by using spreading. So they used spreading to provide protection against interference. And but then when they did that, they also got a lot of interference diversity. So I won't go into details. But essentially, they got even more spectral efficiency. And there was a lots of battle between GSM and their version of CDMA, and both sides of the fence. And I was consulting on both sides. Ultimately, I think it turned out that TDMA could do it also. CDMA had no particular advantage, but CDMA got there first, and so it became much more common. And so, of course, Qualcomm was a pioneer, and there's a lot of work done by NTT Docomo, by somebody called Fumiko Adachi, a friend of mine. And then Europeans adopted it and became the 3G standard, WCDMA standard. So I was very much involved with these things. I was writing papers, I was a consultant to a number of these companies. Next slide. So then we were still looking for more spectral efficiency, but now data was coming into the fore. So we were switching from circuit switch networks to packet switch networks. We wanted more data, and we wanted to go to much wider band channels to get speed. So for a key idea that we discovered some years earlier became to the fore. Next slide. And this is the idea of MIMO. I landed at Stanford in '91, and I just retired recently from the Indian Navy. But so by some circumstance, I filed this patent in 1992 of using how can MIMO enhance the capacity of a network. And initially, it's interesting that for many years, people felt it won't never work. But ultimately, around 1998, things began to change, and I started my first company, and then people realized that it actually does work. I mean, there are thousands of people. I think there are probably 10 or 15,000 people who work in MIMO around the world, industry and in research, and Professor Kurchi is one of them. I was trying to find some capacity formulas, and I was trying to do it for what's called a Ricean channel. Turns out that was a very complicated results, and in fact only recently I wrote some papers using something called character expansions. Even that paper took a long time to get accepted because the math was so complicated. But my friend Jerry Fuschini at Bell Labs and Mike Gans, somebody called Mike Gans, took the idea of making an abstract channel called an IID channel, and then using all the formulas from random matrix theory came up with lots of asymptotic formulas. And someone called Imre Teletar, who's now a professor in Switzerland, came up with the capacity numbers and so on and so forth, and MIMO began to grow. And then in '98 I formed my first company, and we showed that MIMO, we combined with something called OFDMA, and MIMO OFDMA actually works in a cellular network. That became WiMAX, we were acquired by Intel, and so on and so forth. Next slide. So that was 4G, packet switched now, and it uses a technology called waveform technology, OFDMA, which is well suited for broadband systems. So, and also very well suited for MIMO. So MIMO OFDMA was a marriage made in heaven. Initially, when I was trying to propose it, a lot of people opposed it, including Qualcomm. But it took some time, many years for them to sort of agree that this is the right way to do it. And then, it's a very efficient system because it uses MIMO. It didn't have the interference averaging effect of CDMA, but we had some other ideas to make it happen. The first company which actually developed this was IOSpan, my first company, but Intel came into it, called it WiMAX. 3GPP then made a standard called 4G, LTE, and then of course many other companies jumped in. Next slide. So where is mobile technology today? About 7.8 billion phones. I think this is probably a couple of years ago. 96% global penetration is remarkable. About 45% today have broadband, that is LTE, 4G. There's a little bit of WiMAX too. Smartphones, about 3.8 billion smartphones in the world, and all of them have LTE and also have Wi-Fi. Both, by the way, use MIMO OFDMA. And the big Ericsson players are Ericsson, Huawei, Nokia, Samsung, and maybe a couple of more. Semiconductors are Qualcomm, MediaTek, and Intel. And the peak speeds are about 200 megabits per second, but an average speed in the US is about 25 megabits. In India, it's a little lower, at about 6 or 7 megabits per second. And this is where we are today, and we're now moving to the next generation of technology called 5G. I'll say a few remarks about that. Next slide. Okay, before that, somebody mentioned, so it also happens the US Patent Office, almost all the important ideas in the world get patented in the United States. So they recognize the important patents in this thing. So they have an exhibition in the Patent Office. The Patent Office itself is a huge place in Washington, D.C., probably as big as North Block and South Block combined together. So there's an exhibition there. But there are 9 people in wireless. Marconi was recognized, and Oliver Lodge for their patents. Fessenden for AM radio. Armstrong for FM radio. Hedy Lamar for frequency hopping. Amos Joel for cellular. And then Andy Viterbi and Erwin Jacobs for CDMA. And then I was recognized this year for MIMO. Next. And we need to get Professor J.C. Bose into this list. He was apparently nominated some years ago. Something didn't go wrong, but I'm still trying. I think he will be inducted also. Next slide. Okay, so 5G we come to 5G, and we're now, this is likely to happen now in the next 2-3 years. And I've been involved with the government in looking at forming a committee to look at how India should embrace 5G. Some remarks. Next slide. So to think about 5G is 2, 3, and 4G are all about phones. 5G is much more than phones. It's not just phones, but it's going to connect lots of other things. It's going to connect sensors, actuators, controllers, vehicles, machines, and so on and so forth. So it's a much more pervasive technology, really a fabric of a city, and provides India with a huge opportunity. India, our infrastructure is still very weak. We're still developing, and 5G can help us leapfrog some of the weaknesses. So I think it's very, very important for India. Probably more important than any other major country because of our weakness of our infrastructure. Next slide. So all of you probably know about 5G. There's plenty of information on the web, and so I won't go deeper into it. 5G will take speeds. Today 4G is probably 250 megabits. 5G will take us to 20 gigabits probably. So it'll be much higher speed. Next slide. So this is the roadmap for 5G, and Professor Kiran Kuchi is involved with it. So I think release 14 was done. Release 15 is going to get done end of this year. That's why he was recently in the United States. Release 16 will happen next year, and then the deployments will start. And I think my general vision is that in 5G, India should not be too far behind the rest of the world. Maybe a year or so. We don't want to be right in the big front because it might be expensive for us. It takes some time for technology to settle down, but we must not be too far behind also. But our huge opportunity in 5G really is in applications. The platform core technologies, it's very difficult for us to get into it because it's already people have spent billions of dollars building them. But in the applications area, there's a lot of room for us because, and a lot of room for ITI. Because those things, it's not like a phone that you can manufacture. For example, the Samsung 9S9 is manufactured in there's a plant in Vietnam. They build 50% of the global phones, 9S phones. The turnover, that one factory is $55 billion. And, but they sell it all over the world. But in 5G, with all these applications, that's not going to happen. It has to be customized for local needs. And that's a big opportunity for our country. Next slide. So something all of you know about, 5G has sort of 3 big buckets. One is high-speed connectivity, which will open up new applications. Second bucket is massive IoT, to connect lots of sensors and controllers. And third one is pretty new, is to build wireless is not very reliable, but build really ultra-reliable wireless links with very low latency. That will enable a lot more new applications. For example, if you're controlling a machinery remotely, you need to have a ping pong period or ping period around 1 or 2 milliseconds. Otherwise, the human eye and hand coordination won't work. And so that kind of low latency and high reliability will enable many applications. I would say that our vision of 5G is still very, very limited. If 10 years ago when smartphones first came, who could have thought all these applications will come? So similarly in 5G, everything 5G is still in the future, mostly unabandoned. So it's our innovation, it's our drive and that can bring that and create a lot of opportunities for India. Next slide. So technology in 5G is not that different from 4G. It's almost similar. It's still MIMO OFDMA, and they're probably going to be hanging around for many, many more years. But one new thing is we've gone to the millimetric band. This is the band that, of course, the J.C. Bose pioneered, and it's now, normally people have thought it would be impossible to use, but the work of New York University, Ted Rappaport, a friend of mine, and others showed that it actually is usable. So we're going to bring the millimetric band into 5G. And MIMO FTMA is going to be modified with something called vector numerology. I won't go into details. So what they call this radio 5G NR, basically a MIMO FTMA radio with some minor twists around it. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, good. So what happened was some months ago, Secretary Sundararajan asked me to get involved with India. I've been involved for the last 15 years heavily with China, but never with India. Only India involvement was always where I had some companies and we had backends in India. I'll come for that. I'm also, of course, know the IITs well. I know Kiran and others. But most of my government involvement was in China. But this time the Indian government asked me to get involved. So we just came up with a report. We had a forum and a committee. The report is online, and I think Mr. Agarwal can give you the links to look at it. Let me highlight a few things of the report that are relevant to people here in the hall. Next slide. Spectrum, I will pass on that, it's not important. Next slide. Okay, so one is we have an initiative called Use Case Labs. So 5G is all about applications, particularly for India, the opportunities in applications, not so much in the platform technologies. So here, there's an enormous source of potential for innovation. And so in order to support that, as innovations come up, is to able to do the interoperability testing of our devices with the network. So we're setting up use case labs in different economic verticals, agriculture, railways, banking. That's going to be a big opportunity for the startup companies over here. So please pay attention. The government will launch all these within 30 days, and the Secretary Sundararajan is adamant that this will happen. Next slide. The other one is there have been, India has been not in the 5G picture. There's been at least 250 trials all over the world, lots of things going on, but we have not paid attention. So finally, we are now waking up. So none of us really understand 5G properly. So we need to understand 5G, look at what it can do for us. And since it's not just about phones, all these economic verticals have to understand it. So lots of efforts to try and spread the role of 5G within the various entities in our country. And that's also another initiative. It's very important that in the use case labs and in this initiative, ITI is involved, so that they can not only learn it, but they can also spread that to within the startup ecosystem in Bangalore. Next slide. This is a very important one. Mr. C.S. Rao is driving a lot of this. So, the world, as I said, has already had 250 trials, so we need to start quickly. So we have, this is chaired by Madam. And so the idea of trials really is to help advance technology and business model learning for TSP, service providers, economic verticals, which will use 5G, academia, and Indian tech industry. So people like all the startups over here, and including ITI. So the idea of trials is not merely run the trial, but all of us to get involved and learn how to use it, how to develop technology for it, and so on and so forth. And the government has invited the major OEMs to come to India, and we want to conduct probably 4 major trials, could be more, but we want to make sure they don't overlap too much, because 5G has many technologies, so we don't want to have too much overlap. And many of the technology is not yet ready, so it will take 3-4 more years. But we will launch a trial very quickly right now, within the next 2-3 months. Mr. C.S. Rao will help drive that. But we will have to space these trials out so that we also are ready to use the trial. There's no point them coming and doing something and walking away. We want to learn everything we can and how do we build products for the system. And and some of the trials will be in public sector, that means mainly funded by the government largely. And this is mainly focused on applications. So we want to bring up our industries, our startups, our public sector units to build technology around 5G. It may not be in the core platform because it may be a little too late for that, but around the applications. In fact, my prediction is there's $100 billion of application technology needed by the country over the next 10 years. So we should all that is an opportunity. And third one, we want to have a flagship 5G event in India where we dazzle the world with what we can do. That will take 3-4 more years to plan, but we want to have a public-private partnership to have a major flagship event around 5G to show the world that we are also there. Next slide. Okay, this is a one-liner on startups. If I were given a part of the inaugural ceremony, I would have talked more about it. But let me say a few things. One is, it's important, we are not today part of the global top ecosystem, and India is not there, but we need to get there. And I've been telling the government that in 10 years, getting 3 or 4 companies in the top 500 should be a goal. And but everything, the only way we get there is through startups. And to build startups, to scale to global level, we need new ideas. You can't take on Huawei, you can't take on Intel with the current technology and beat them. They're just too powerful. We ought to come up with new ideas, and that's how we go forward. In that context, I'd like to mention Professor Kurchi, who is here. He's a remarkable innovator. I think he's in the top 3 or 4 top scientists we have in our country in wireless. It's his ideas and people like him. On these pillars, we can build India and take India into a global leadership and recognition. And also, I should also say, innovation is important, but I've done 3 startups myself. Perseverance is even more important. Things never go right. I think I've been involved with startups for about 10 years. Not a single day I would come into the company. I was always a professor at Stanford, but it was always my sideshow. Come into the company and not knowing whether the company will exist at the end of the day. Because there's always so much competition. Every bright person, there are 10 other brighter people. And it's very, very tough. So startup world is a hard world. So for your success often is innovation and perseverance. And I think ITI also, it's very important for ITI now to find working models to work with startups. And you've got to remember that it's not easy for them to succeed. So you've got to go half the way to help them. Their success is your success. And I think we're just starting, but I want Mr. Agrawal and the CMD to really focus on this. There's plenty of talent in Bangalore, plenty of talent. And I'm also working with the government to see whether we can form an Apex committee in government by which we can really say that we really have to get into the world-class layer. How do we get there? That may take some time, but ITI and startups must work together. And finding even new business models for doing that is important. And both have to meet each other halfway. We still have lots of problems in our country for startups. Funding is really a difficult situation, which we need to fix. And also, when companies start growing, most of the technology is a zero-sum game. If we grow, somebody else may not grow. So we'll have lots of lawsuits and IPR problems and all that. I've been involved with China. They were absolutely firm about protecting their companies. So we too, once we find a company is growing, we need to protect it properly. So lots of things have to be done to make that happen. So this is a picture of David and Goliath. And whether what Kurchi is doing or what I did, we took on Intel or Qualcomm and beat them. So it's always possible, just that you have a smarter team. And so don't think that these companies are not beatable. They're very beatable, but you got to work harder than them and be more innovative than them. And you've got to get the right talent. We need very, very bright people. And so this is the Chinese saying, which they often fond of saying that fortune favors the bold. So you've got to be bold too. Thank you. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so the story of mobile communications has been a remarkable one in the last 35 years or so. We've probably grown a factor of 1 million in coverage and speed and subscribers. And the next 30 years, it's hard to predict, but it'll be even bigger than last 30 years. So it's going to be a huge opportunity. And this time, India should be in the club of the world. We should have companies at the global level with equally big reputations. And I know India well, and I know China very well. I certainly know the United States. We can actually do it. There's no question why we can't do it. So we can do it. It's just determination. And so I think the challenge in India is we are really good users of technology. We all have the latest device in our pocket. But we've got to build some of this stuff here. Not so much to make in India as much as invent in India. That's the more important thing. So with that, let me finish, and thank you very much.